Good morning, 8th graders. Today we are going to talk about your next project, which is the modified version of cartoon blow-ups. And I just happen to have all the steps laid out here, and Nimbus is going to join the party too, because that's what he does. So we're going to go through and explain and show what to do, and then you're going to see me go through the steps. Step 1, you guys, you need to find an image. Now, I know all of you might not have access to a printer, let alone a color printer. Cool thing is we don't necessarily need your image in color, so even something out of a magazine, even the cover from if you have a game system at home without a cat butt here. So any kind of image that you can find, I would not go smaller than something like this. If you can see this, this is actually the one I'm going to show you guys for the example. But this is about 4 inches by 4.5 inches, just where Link is here. I would not go smaller than that because things might get a little hard to see. But again, because this is the modified version of what your other classmates have done, we're going to use whatever we have at our disposal to make this work the best for you. So, step 1, find an image. Step 2 is we need to find a protective covering for your image. Now, if you came in and were able to grab some supplies that I had set out for 4th quarter, 8th grade, you should be all set. But let's say for some reason you couldn't make it in. There are options. For those of you that came in, you're going to have a plastic grid like this. This is great. The gridding is already done for you. You're good to go. However, if your image is not the size of a regular piece of paper, let's say it's something smaller, then we might have to modify even that grid. And here are some options. If you've got a plastic baggie at home, we can use that for the protective covering. If you have a page protector, if you can kind of see that, that would work. In a pinch, even plastic wrap would work. But I'd say out of all those options, the plastic wrap is probably the most fussy. So even if you've got something like a plastic bag, and again, that's what I'm going to show you for this example, because I'm trying to pretend that you guys don't have everything at your disposal, but this is something that in most houses, I think, there's at least one little Ziploc bag around somewhere. So that would be step 2, is finding a protective covering for your image. Step 3, finding good paper. Now again, if you were able to come in and grab supplies, you have a pretty large piece of paper. If that's not going to work, or you don't have one, or it got destroyed, you might go to something that's a little smaller. That piece of paper here, that's about half the size of this one. Or we might get as simple as copy paper or even notebook paper. For the example I'm going to show you guys, again, I'm going to pretend that I don't have much at my disposal, and I'm going to show you how to do this whole thing on 4 sheets of notebook paper. Step 4, and I messed it up a little bit here, is going to be accurately drawing your grid. But going back to, let's say, the notebook paper, I took and I laid out 4 pieces of notebook paper and I taped it together on the back with Scotch tape. And I tried to keep the tape as smooth as possible because I'm going to be drawing on the front side. And then I added my grid, which is what we're going to talk about today as soon as I get done showing you guys all the steps. Some of the supplies that you could potentially need. If you've got a yardstick, that's great. If you don't, something just with a long straight edge would work. Also, if you've got a smaller ruler, that's also great. But if not, something with a long straight edge. Rulers for the first part of this do really come in handy though, because we are going to need to measure 4 parts of your grid. So hopefully you can get your hands on one somewhere. That's usually there's a ruler around your house somewhere. The other thing that would come in handy for doing the grid on your protective covering, a Sharpie works best, but if not, a pen will work if you give it time to dry so it does not smudge. So again, whatever you've got on hand. Also, you might need to use a scissors and a few different types of pencils, a sharpener if you got it, an eraser, all that kind of stuff. So again, it's basic school supplies, and I realize not everybody's got the same thing, but if you can get something close, that's going to help you out quite a bit. And then the last 2 steps that I'm going to be showing you at a later date, step 5 and step 6, is going to be to draw your chosen character. In this case, I'm going to do Link from Legend of Zelda on your enlarged grid that I'm going to show you how to draw today. And then we're going to end up finishing the drawing by adding shading in a variety of marks. Now the examples that I'm showing you, these are my old examples for the original project. Your piece is going to look different than this. So I can't stress that enough. Do not think you have to use all these different colored markers to get the effect that this one tends to have. If you would like to try that effect, I'm going to show you how I do this one. But for most of you, again, I'm going to pretend that you do not have access to all these fine tip markers, and instead the only thing you might have access to is a pencil. So the version that I'm going to show you is using different marks with pencil instead of doing what's called pointillism or stippling with dots. If we look really close, let's say at her armor, that's all little dots put together and different colors mixed together, so when you zoom out, it turns into the piece that it's supposed to look like with all the colors that it has. So I hope this makes sense so far. We're going to start gridding next. Gridding. So let's say, like I said again, that you don't have this nice inch by inch grid that I believe is about 9 squares wide and 12 squares long. And also, let's say you don't have a full color image that's printed on copy paper. If you do, great. Even if your image isn't full color and it's black and white will work wonderfully for this modified project. But however, if you do have the grid and an image that you can print out, or something from a magazine or a newspaper that's the size of your grid, go ahead and tape your grid down. As you can see, I have 2 pieces of tape at the top. That's so that this creates a hinge and your grid doesn't start to pivot like this. It stays straight every time you want to flip it back down. What I did, if I didn't have the big clear grid that you guys had available if you were able to pick stuff up at school, is I gridded on this Ziploc bag. So what I ended up doing is whatever I want to transfer as my image to my larger piece of paper, I put it inside this bag and I just traced a box around my image, so that way I know when I actually go to my large gridded paper, I know this is going to transfer to this, and it's going to be accurate because I have the same amount of squares and I have them divided in virtually the same size as this. These aren't perfect squares, so if I keep saying squares, I apologize. They're actually rectangles because they're a little bit taller than they are wide. What I gridded on my paper, they're a little bit taller than they are wide. So make sure that things are going to line up and that things are going to measure up. So that's what I'm going to explain to you now, is how do you actually draw this up? How do you draw your grid so that it's accurate? I'm going to take this out so that it's easier to see, because right now Link is taking up a lot of my attention and I want to just look at the grid for right now. To measure out the grid, as you can see, I kind of did some of the work for you already. I have it going 4 inches one way and 4.5 inches the other way. To make this grid accurate and to transfer it accurately and enlarge it accurately to my big piece of paper, what I started with is I divided this whole thing in half. So we know half of 4 is 2. So I put a little mark up at the top at the 2, and I slid my ruler down, and then I put a little mark at the bottom of the 2. So now I know that this whole big square was divided in half equally. Then I did the same thing for each half. I divided that in half again. So what I ended up doing is at the 1 and at the 3, I put a little mark. I brought my ruler back up. Again at the 1 and at the 3, I put a little mark. And then I drew a line. So then I started with 4 little bars coming down. So my square was now divided into quarters vertically. Then I would do the same thing sideways. Took a little bit more math because instead of being 4 this way, it's 4.5. But all I had to do was find out what is half of 4.5 on my ruler, divide it in half horizontally, and then divide each one of those halves in half again. So then I have quarters, 1, 2, 3, 4, going horizontally. The last thing that I needed to do was to divide each one of those quarters in half again. That's going to give me 8 columns one way and 8 rows the other way. So it is a perfect 8 by 8 as far as being sectioned off. However, please keep in mind, they are a little bit narrower one way than they are the other way. These little boxes are a little taller than they are wide, and that's okay as long as when I go to my large paper, they are also a little bit taller than they are wide, which is exactly how they are. So next step is we're going to grid out our large piece. So I put Link inside the bag. As you can see, the grid is all divided on him, and I've got him shoved down into the corner of the bag, so hopefully he does not move. If he does, I'll just shake the bag until he gets back in his right spot. So now, to divvy up our large paper, just to remind you, I took and I taped 4 sheets of notebook paper together. Now my grid lines are a little bit darker than you probably want them, but because this is a demo and because we're on notebook paper and I wanted you to be able to see it on camera, I made them a little bit darker, but I know I'll just have a little bit more erasing to do later. Your goal, keep your grid lines as light as possible, just so that you can erase most of what you don't need after a while. Good example of lighter grid lines would be on my partial work that I've used for an example in the past over here. There's a little bit of a difference on how light they are. Grid out your now taped together big sheet of paper, unless you've got a large sheet that you were able to grab from school. What I did is I decided, well, how big do I want this to be on my taped together notebook paper? Because I want a border. That's what I'm going to be using to practice my mark making later. Just like I have little scribbles of marker over here, I'm going to be doing that around the outside edges of my grid here as practice before I start the shading of my final drawing. So what I'm going to be doing now is I decided I want this about 1 foot wide. Now if this is 1 foot wide, I know it needs to be longer because my grid for Link is taller than it is wide. So I kept it easy on myself. Try and keep it easy on yourselves, okay? Gridding is hard enough, but we know 12 is an easy number to start with. We know what half of 12 is, and then we know what half of that is. So if we were to take and divide this into quarters, that would give us the same starting point that we had for our smaller grid, just enlarged. At the 3-inch, the 6-inch, the 9-inch, and then at the 12-inch, that's where I put marks, slid my ruler down, that's where I put marks, and again, this is after I drew my square out. Then I would take and draw all of my sectioned out pieces. I did the same the long way. Now this is where a yardstick might come in handy. So if you have a yardstick, great. If you don't have a yardstick, you can use a ruler. You'll just have to slide this down a little bit and try and keep it in line with the grid lines you already have drawn. But again, just like on your small grid, you will take and divide your vertical lines into quarters and then divide those quarters in half again. So again, if you look, each one of these sections, so here, 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 and here, those were my quarters that I started off with. And then I took and divided those quarters into half again, which is where I came up with the other set of lines. In essence, when you're all done, you just want to draw a big graph, a big grid. It's like ginormous graph paper. I hope this helps with your first step for the cartoon blow up. The gridding for some people can actually be very daunting, meaning it can be kind of difficult. But once you have that, then when you start drawing your image, then it becomes a piece of cake. Then you're just following a square at a time because you know you're accurate from your original image to your blown up image. Hence the name Cartoon Blow Up. Okay, thanks for watching the first step, guys. Bye.